The imaginary companion, inner life, projection, and the psychic dialogue in Great are the myths. At the center of Great are the myths lies a relationship that is deliberately difficult to categorize. The bond between Birdie and the boy is neither simply romantic nor merely historical. It exists somewhere between emotional reality, psychological projection, and symbolic companionship. In many ways, the novel invites the reader to ask a question that remains suspended throughout the narrative. What exactly is Birdie in relation to the boy? On the surface, she is a childhood friend who grows alongside him as his life expands into fame. But beneath that narrative layer lies another possibility, that Birdie functions as an interior companion, a figure emerging from the boy's imaginative and emotional life. The novel repeatedly gestures toward this ambiguity without ever resolving it. Their conversations about shared dreamscapes, the boarding school imagined simultaneously by both of them, and the sense that they can enter each other's minds all point toward a deeper symbolic dimension of their relationship. Seen from a psychological perspective, the connection between Birdie and the boy can be interpreted through the lens of Carl Jung's theory of anima and animus. The idea that every individual carries within them an inner counterpart of the opposite gender, a figure that represents the unconscious bridge between instinct, imagination, and emotional integration. Within this framework, Birdie becomes more than a character. She becomes a psychological presence, Elvis Presley, and the evidence of an inner world. The inspiration for this interpretive layer begins with a historical observation about Elvis Presley himself. Many of his friends and associates described him as possessing a remarkably rich fantasy life. He was known to read widely, especially spiritual texts and philosophical works, and he often spoke about metaphysical ideas with a seriousness that surprised those who knew him primarily as a public entertainer. Accounts from those close to him describe long late-night conversations about religion, the soul, reincarnation, and the nature of reality. Elvis seemed drawn towards speculative thinking about the invisible structures underlying ordinary life. At the same time, observers often noticed a persistent emotional longing in him, something that seemed both powerful and unresolved. This combination, imagination, introspection, and longing, suggests the presence of a strong inner world. In psychological terms, such individuals frequently maintain vivid interior relationships with imagined figures, archetypes, or symbolic companions. These are not pathological hallucinations, but rather manifestations of the psyche's attempt to articulate itself. The question therefore emerges naturally. If Elvis possessed such an expansive inner life, what form might that interior dialogue have taken? The character of Birdie arises from precisely this question. Birdie as imaginary companion. Imaginary companions are often associated with childhood, but psychological research has long shown that they can persist into adulthood in more subtle forms. Writers, artists, and musicians frequently describe experiencing creative dialogue with imagined figures. These companions function not as illusions but as internal interlocutors, voices through which individuals explore emotional and intellectual possibilities. Birdie may be understood in this way. She represents a presence that accompanies the boy across the stages of his life. She appears in moments of intimacy and reflection rather than public spectacle. She's both familiar and elusive, both part of his world and slightly removed from it. Importantly, she differs from him in key ways. Where the boy is constrained by expectation, fame, and cultural role, Birdie embodies freedom. She moves across social boundaries. She travels between worlds, Memphis, New York, Hollywood, the desert. She speaks with ease across class structures and cultural spaces. This contrast suggests that Birdie may represent a psychic counterbalance to the boy's external identity. She embodies qualities that his public life restricts: autonomy, introspection, and emotional fluidity. Even her name carries symbolic resonance. Birdie evokes flight, movement, and freedom. The image of the bird has long served as a metaphor for the soul in literature and mythology. At the same time, the name gestures playfully toward the cultural satire, "Bye Bye Birdie," which itself reflected the phenomenon of Elvis-like celebrity in American culture. The name therefore holds both symbolic and cultural meaning simultaneously. Birdie is both an interior figure and a cultural commentary. The anima and animus in Jungian psychology. Carl Jung proposed that every psyche contains unconscious elements that complement the conscious identity of the individual. For men, the anima represents the inner feminine presence, an archetype associated with emotional depth, intuition, imagination, and connection to the unconscious. For women, the animus functions as the corresponding inner masculine figure. These figures often appear in dreams, fantasies, or creative works as distinct personalities. They serve as mediators between conscious awareness and the deeper layers of the psyche. When viewed through this framework, the relationship between Birdie and the boy takes on a symbolic dimension. Birdie can be interpreted as the boy's anima, a figure through whom he encounters parts of himself that his external identity cannot fully express. Several elements in the novel reinforce this reading. First, Birdie frequently appears in moments of introspection rather than public action. She participates in quiet conversations, dreamlike landscapes, and imaginative spaces where the boy confronts his fears and desires. Second, their relationship is not governed by ordinary social logic. They move in and out of each other's lives in ways that feel both natural and mysterious. At times, they seem almost telepathically connected, sharing dream environments or sensing each other across distances. Third, Birdie's presence allows the boy to explore vulnerability. He confesses anxieties about fame, mortality, and the army in ways he rarely does with others. In Jungian terms, the anima often facilitates precisely this kind of emotional articulation. She becomes the psychic partner through whom the unconscious speaks. The desert as psychological landscape. One of the most revealing locations in the novel is the desert in Palm Springs, where Birdie and the boy spend their final days together before the trajectories of their lives diverge. The desert has long functioned in literature as a symbolic landscape of introspection and revelation. Stripped of the noise and complexity of social life, it becomes a space where individuals confront themselves more directly. Within this setting, the relationship between Birdie and the boy takes on a heightened quality. Their conversations drift between memory, imagination, and philosophical speculation. They question whether they might exist as imaginary companions for one another. They reflect on the possibility that their connection belongs as much to dreams as to ordinary life. This ambiguity is not presented as a problem to be solved, but as a poetic dimension of their relationship. The desert becomes a liminal environment where inner and outer realities blur. The double life of myth and psychology. The broader theme of Great Are the Myths is the construction of cultural mythology in the modern world. Yet the relationship between Birdie and the boy introduces another layer, the mythology of the inner self. Just as society constructs legends around public figures, individuals construct symbolic narratives within their own minds. These narratives help organize emotional experience and give shape to longing, memory, and identity. Birdie exists at the intersection of these two mythologies. She participates in the cultural myth of Elvis Presley, the global icon, but she also embodies a private myth within the boy's psyche. In this sense, the novel explores two parallel processes: the creation of public myth, the creation of inner symbolic companions. Both are forms of storytelling that human beings use to understand themselves. Freedom and constraint. The symbolic contrast between Birdie and the boy also reflects broader themes within the novel. The boy becomes increasingly constrained by fame, expectation, and cultural projection. his identity solidifies into the figure that the world recognizes as Elvis Presley. Birdie, by contrast, remains fluid. She moves between social environments and retains a sense of independence from the structures that define the boy's life. She marries, becomes a mother, and continues to evolve beyond the narrative that once bound them together. If the boy represents myth crystallizing into legend, Birdie represents myth remaining alive within the imagination. She is the figure who can still move freely across worlds. The psychological truth of fiction. Ultimately, the question of whether Birdie is literally imaginary is less important than the symbolic truth her character expresses. Fiction often provides a language for psychological realities that cannot easily be articulated in historical biography. The idea that Elvis might have possessed an interior companion is not a literal claim about his life. Instead, it serves as a narrative device through which the novel explores the complexity of creative consciousness. Artists frequently maintain relationships with internal figures that shape their work and emotional lives. These figures can appear in dreams, in creative impulses, or in imagined conversations that guide artistic expression. Birdie represents this phenomenon in narrative form. Conclusion: the companion of the soul. The relationship between Birdie and the boy therefore operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a love story, a friendship, a symbolic dialogue, and a psychological exploration. Seen through a Jungian lens, Birdie may be understood as the boy's anima, the inner feminine presence that connects him to imagination, vulnerability, and emotional depth. Seen through a literary lens, she functions as a narrative embodiment of the inner life that accompanies creative individuals. And seen through the broader themes of the novel, she becomes part of the mythology that surrounds both private identity and public legend. In this way, Great Are the Myths does not simply tell a story about celebrity culture. It also explores the deeper mystery of how human beings construct companions within their own inner worlds, figures who help them navigate longing, creativity, and the search for meaning. Birdie, in the end, may be understood as precisely such a companion, a presence born from imagination, sustained by memory, and existing somewhere between dream and reality. Like the myths that give the novel its title, she is not defined by literal truth, but by symbolic resonance. And in that sense, she is as real as any figure who has ever lived in the human imagination.